They thought you were the one shaking, the one breaking, the one losing control under pressure. Funny how perception changes when silence starts speaking louder than noise. Now every step you take feels different to them. Every move you make hits like a warning they didn't prepare for. It's not confidence anymore. It's something deeper, something unsettling, something that makes their comfort feel unsafe. They can feel it before it even arrives, that shift in the air, that pressure in the chest, that quiet realization that the story they wrote about you is falling apart in real time. They underestimated the silence you were building because they never understood what silence actually means in a person who has decided not to waste energy explaining themselves anymore. To them, silence looked like absence, like surrender, like a sign that nothing was happening beneath the surface. They measured you with their own limitations, assuming that if they couldn't see movement, there must be none. But they never realized that the most dangerous kind of progress doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't perform for attention. It grows quietly, like something being forged in the dark where no eyes are watching and no voices are interrupting. While they were busy talking, judging, and forming opinions based on incomplete moments of your life, something different was happening within you. Every insult they brushed off, every doubt they planted, every moment they ignored you became part of something heavier, something that didn't break you but reshaped you. Silence wasn't emptiness for you, it was storage. You stored lessons, you stored pain, you stored patterns. You stored the realization of who stands when things are not comfortable anymore. And in that storage, you were building something they couldn't track because they were too loud to notice what quiet construction looks like. They thought your quietness meant you had stopped trying, but they never considered that maybe you had stopped showing. There is a difference they will never understand until it is too late. Showing is for approval, for acceptance, for reaction, but building in silence removes all dependence on reaction. It becomes internal, self-directed, untouchable by outside opinions. That is where they lost track of you, not when you slowed down, but when you stopped giving them access to your process. They laughed at delays. They assumed pauses meant failure. They mistook stillness for defeat. But what they didn't see was the shift happening in your mindset, where every second of quiet was being converted into clarity. You were not stuck. You were filtering. You were removing noise from intention, distraction from direction, emotion from execution. And that kind of internal restructuring doesn't need witnesses. It only needs consistency. They built their confidence on what they could show others. You started building something that didn't care to be shown until it was undeniable. That's why they couldn't sense the change. It wasn't loud enough for their attention, but it was deep enough to change everything. The foundation they thought was weak was actually being reinforced in ways they cannot see from the outside. And now, what they once called nothing is slowly turning into something they can no longer ignore. The irony is they feel comfortable in the story they wrote about you when you were silent, not knowing that silence was never agreement. It was observation. It was patience. It was understanding exactly who deserves what version of you. And while they assumed they had time, You were already outgrowing the version of yourself they thought would stay the same forever. What they underestimated was not your voice, not your reaction, not your presence, but your ability to disappear into focus and return without warning. Every setback was turning into sharper focus, because nothing they tried to use against you landed the way they expected it to. What was supposed to slow you down only started refining your direction. Where they saw failure, you started seeing instruction. Where they saw delay, you started seeing correction. It was never just about what happened to you, but about what you extracted from it when nobody was clapping, when nobody was watching, when nobody cared enough to understand the weight behind your quiet persistence. Each moment that was meant to break your rhythm instead exposed something you needed to see, not the surface, level pain they assumed would define you, but the hidden patterns repeating around you. The people who only stayed when things were easy, the environments that only supported you when you were useful, the expectations that were never designed for your growth, but for your limitation. Every setback stripped another layer of illusion, and what remained was clarity sharpened through discomfort. They thought repetition of struggle would eventually weaken you, but they didn't understand what happens when someone stops negotiating with pain and starts studying it. You stopped asking why it was happening and started observing what it was revealing. That shift alone changed everything. Because once you stop treating setbacks as personal attacks and start treating them as data, you become harder to manipulate, harder to discourage, harder to predict. They expected emotional collapse, but instead they created analytical awareness. Every disappointment became a point of reflection. Every closed door became a signal rather than a stop. Every loss became a measurement of what not to repeat. And slowly, without announcing it, your thinking became sharper, your decisions more deliberate, your patience more calculated. Not because things got easier, but because you stopped reacting the way they expected you to. There is a quiet transformation that happens when frustration no longer controls interpretation. You begin to see timing differently. You begin to see people differently. You begin to see effort differently. What used to feel like defeat starts to feel like redirection, not in a hopeful sense, but in a practical one. You realize that not everything that blocks you is an enemy, and not everything that delays you is a loss. Some things are just revealing how unprepared the path was for your presence. They assumed setbacks would scatter your focus, but instead it compressed it, like pressure turning something loose into something solid. You became more intentional without becoming louder, more aware without becoming emotional, more grounded without needing reassurance. And that is where they lost the ability to predict your next move, because you were no longer operating from the same emotional patterns they once triggered. Even their expectations of how you should respond became irrelevant. They waited for frustration, but you delivered calculation. They waited for confusion, but you delivered adjustment. They waited for retreat, but you delivered adaptation. Every time they tried to define your limits, you expanded past them quietly, without explanation, without performance, without permission. And what they never understood is that setbacks didn't interrupt your path. They revealed it. They removed everything unnecessary. They exposed what was real and what was temporary. They forced attention inward, where the actual work was happening. And in that space, away from judgment and assumption, something unshakable started forming, something that no setback was capable of reversing. What they called weakness was silent preparation, because they were only capable of recognizing strength when it made noise, when it demanded attention, when it came wrapped in confidence. They could immediately understand. Anything outside that frame looked like hesitation to them, like uncertainty, like something unfinished. They never considered that not all preparation looks aggressive, not all growth looks visible, not all strength announces itself before it arrives. Some of it stays hidden until it no longer needs permission to exist. While they were busy interpreting your quieter phases as decline, something else was forming underneath. You were not collapsing into weakness. You were withdrawing from unnecessary exposure. There is a difference between being broken and being intentional about what you reveal. They confused your restraint for lack of capability. Not realizing restraint is often the highest form of control. Because when you stop reacting to everything, you start choosing what deserves your energy, and that choice alone begins to rebuild you in ways they cannot measure. What they saw as hesitation was actually refinement. You were not rushing into every direction just to prove motion. You were filtering, adjusting, observing what survives without your constant validation. Weakness, in their language, meant slowing down. But in your process, slowing down meant eliminating what does not align. It meant cutting away distractions that once felt necessary, but were actually delaying clarity. And in that space of reduction, something stronger was being constructed quietly, without noise, without validation, without performance. They never understood that preparation is often invisible, because it happens in thought before it ever becomes action. They were waiting for external proof, while you were building internal structure. They needed evidence to believe progress was happening, but you were operating in a phase where evidence was not yet meant for them. That gap between what is being built and what is being seen is where most misunderstandings are born, and that is exactly where they misjudged you. They saw moments where you didn't respond and assumed you had nothing to respond with. They saw pauses and assumed emptiness. They saw distance and assumed disconnection, but none of those interpretations matched reality. In truth, those were moments of recalibration, moments where you were aligning intention with direction instead of reacting impulsively to pressure that meant nothing in the larger structure you were building. What they labeled as weakness was actually resistance to being shaped by external expectation. You stopped allowing urgency to dictate your pace. You stopped allowing judgment to define your worth in motion. You stopped treating every challenge as something that required immediate reaction. That alone made you unreadable to them, because they depended on predictable responses, and you slowly stopped providing them. Silence became your workspace. Stillness became your method. Observation became your advantage. And in that environment, what looked like inactivity was actually controlled development. Every thought processed without interruption became part of a larger shift in how you see things, how you respond, how you choose. And that shift is not something they can detect until it has already changed everything. They thought weakness was absence of force, But they never understood that sometimes force is being stored, not lost. And what they dismissed as nothing was actually preparation without interruption, building itself beyond their awareness until recognition becomes too late to matter. The calm in you was never emptiness. It was control, because they were never able to distinguish between someone who is lost and someone who has chosen not to be disturbed. To them, calm meant nothing was happening, as if silence in expression equaled silence in thought. But what they failed to understand is that the loudest chaos is often internal, and the most controlled presence is the one that has already processed it all before anyone else even notices there is something to react to. Your calm was not accidental, it was built. It came from moments where reacting would have cost more than observing, where speaking would have revealed less than staying silent, where emotional response would have weakened clarity. You learned, over time, that not every situation deserves a reaction. Not every provocation deserves attention. Not every voice deserves access to your energy. And in that realization, calm stopped being passive and started becoming strategic. They misread your stillness as absence of thought, but your mind was doing something far more complex than they could track. While they were reacting in real time, you were processing beyond it. You were seeing outcomes before decisions were even made. You were identifying patterns while others were still stuck in the moment. That kind of awareness does not need noise. It needs distance. And that distance is what created the illusion of calm. They assumed calm meant you were unaffected, but the truth was you were unaffected in a way they did not recognize as strength. You were no longer reacting from emotional impulse, but from filtered understanding. That filtering removed unnecessary intensity from your responses. It made your presence less predictable, less accessible, less readable. And in their world, anything that cannot be read easily becomes threatening without saying a word. There is a point where emotional control stops being a choice and becomes a structure. You stopped carrying every external trigger as something personal. You stopped letting temporary moments define long-term direction. You stopped allowing confusion to interrupt clarity, and in that structure, calm became the default state, not because nothing affected you, but because everything was being processed internally before it could ever take control externally. They looked at you and expected reaction patterns they were used to seeing in others. Frustration, defensiveness, emotional breakdown, visible confusion. But what they got instead was restraint, measured response, minimal exposure. That gap between expectation and reality is where they started losing their grip on understanding you, because people who rely on emotional reactions to measure strength cannot interpret silence as anything other than emptiness. But your calm was never empty. It was full of decisions that had already been made internally, full of conclusions that did not require approval, full of awareness that did not need validation. And because it was already resolved within you, there was nothing left to spill outward in chaos. What remained was presence without disturbance, awareness without reaction, control without demonstration. They tried to test it, provoke it, distort it, but calm that is rooted in understanding does not break under pressure that has already been analyzed. It simply holds. And the more they pushed for visible reaction, the more invisible your processing became to them. They were interacting with surface behavior, while missing the entire structure beneath it. And what they never realized is that calm like that does not come from avoidance. It comes from exposure to enough chaos to stop being impressed by it. The moment they ignored you became the moment they started paying attention, because what they dismissed as insignificant was actually the beginning of something they failed to recognize in real time. At first, it looked ordinary to them, just another phase, just another person fading into the background of their assumptions. They didn't think it required acknowledgement. They didn't think it would matter later. That confidence in their judgment is exactly where they lost awareness of what was unfolding beneath their certainty. When they chose to ignore you, they believed they were making a final assessment, as if silence from their side meant closure for yours. But what they didn't understand is that being ignored doesn't erase direction. It removes distraction. And in that removal, something begins to sharpen. You stop splitting your attention across spaces that were never returning anything meaningful. You start observing more, thinking deeper, moving differently without announcing it. And while they continued living under the assumption that nothing changed, everything already had. They didn't notice the shift because they were not looking for it. People rarely pay attention to what they believe they have already dismissed. That's where arrogance blinds awareness. They categorized you too early, placed you too low in their mental hierarchy of importance, and moved on without realizing that movement itself was creating space for transformation. What they thought was irrelevance was actually isolation from interruption, and that isolation is where focus becomes unavoidable. Ignoring you was not an ending for you. It was a release from their perspective. And once that perspective no longer framed your actions, you stopped operating within its limitations. You were no longer reacting to how you were seen. You were building without being observed, adjusting without being judged, learning without being interrupted. That kind of environment creates something most people don't recognize until it is already fully formed. The irony is that while they reduced attention on you, your attention on everything else became sharper. You started noticing patterns they were too busy to see. You started understanding behavior without needing explanations. You started recognizing timing, energy, intent, and silence in ways that only become clear when external validation disappears. And that clarity slowly replaces the need to be seen. Then came the turning point they didn't anticipate. The same person they ignored stopped fitting into the space they left behind. Not because you changed for them, but because you stopped existing in the version they left you in. They assumed absence meant stillness, but absence often means evolution without permission. And when they finally looked again, what they expected no longer matched what stood there. That is when attention returns, but not the same kind. It returns with confusion, with curiosity, with the realization that something moved without notification. They start evaluating what they thought they understood. They start questioning the judgment they made too early, and the space that was once filled with indifference begins to fill with observation they cannot control anymore. But by the time attention returns, the dynamic has already changed. You are no longer shaped by the moment they decided to ignore you. You are shaped by everything that happened after that moment, in spaces they never witnessed, in silence they never considered important, in progress they never bothered to measure. And what they are left with is the realization that ignoring you was never neutral. It was the point where their understanding stopped evolving, while yours kept going without interruption,